In this lecture, we are now going to quickly write the functionality to actually create a channel. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. Let's get into the test editor, then come inside of channel controller, and then now we want to be inside of the save method. So the first thing we want to do here is to actually inject the Legato framework request class. Then pass that to a variable called request. And as you can see here on line 4, you need to include the use statement, use Legato framework request. And then the first thing we want to do here is to create our rules. So the only feed that we are requiring here is the name feed. So the user should actually provide a value for the channel name. So we want to ensure that this is required. So we can set that to be equal to true. And then we also want to specify that the maximum length should not be more than 20 for a channel name. We also want to specify that the value entered into here should be a string. So that means it can contain only letters and space. And then lastly, this should be unique to the channels table in the database. So we're going to say unique. And then we want to say channels table. So after defining our rules, we need to create a validator. So this is going to be our validator object is equal to new validator. So you ensure that you are choosing Legato framework validator. And then we want to pass it all of the requests. So we say request all. And then we also want to pass it our rules. And then we want to do all of the error checking. So because we don't want to keep on repeating ourselves, what we can do is to straight away refactor the way that we do validation. So if we come again inside of the Alt controller, you can see what we are actually doing here. Validator, and then we validate for recapture, and then we try to pass the error response. So this is something that we are going to do in a number of places. As a matter of fact, anywhere that we require the user to actually fill up a form, we are going to be doing this. So I think it's okay for us to just quickly refactor the way that we do this so we can actually streamline what we're doing here so that we don't need to keep repeating the code in line 99 to line 106, and also the code that we have here, line 90 to 94, whenever we want to validate for recapture. So what I'm going to do is come inside of our helper classes. So I want to create a new PHP class here, and I'm going to call this validator helper. And then inside of here, I want to create a static method. So we're going to say public static function pass error. So you remember the problem that we want to solve is the way that we actually prepare our error messages before we send it to the view. So this is something that we're doing frequently. We don't want to keep repeating the same code. So this is going to take two methods. One is request, and the second one will be the validator. So which is going to be Legato framework validator. Save it to a variable called validator. So you ensure that you are also including the code on line 7 and on line 8. So let's come back again to the Alt controller and see what we're doing here. So right here, we are checking for two things. We are checking if validator phase or its array response. Response is when we have to do validation for recapture. So we have to also factor this in. So what we can do is just grab this code, request input g.recapture-response, and then come here and we want to do a check. So we're going to say if request input recapture, if this is not equal to null or false, what we want to do is to actually get the recapture validation response. And then to make that easier, so let's just come here and then create another public static function get recapture response, and we are going to pass this request. So Legato framework request. So what we basically want to do here is just copy all of the code that we have right here from line 90 to line 94. So grab this and then come back to validator EPA, paste this here. And now we can just return this. So we can just say return this. And then we can add some doc block here. Say get recapture response. And then right here, we can now create a variable called response, or you can call that recapture response should be equal to static get recapture response, and then we pass it request. So if this particular input is not sent along with the form, we want to set this response to be equal to false. So this should be equal to none. Then right here, we can now do a check to see if validation actually failed or recapture validation failed. So we can say if validation failed or is array response. So this is essentially what we have done previously. So we can actually just grab the code from the auth controller and paste it here. So I'm going to say validation underscore error is going to be equal to validator error get. And then right here, we're just going to return is array response. So if the response is an array, what we essentially want to do is to merge it to our validation errors. So we want to check if it's an array and it's also not empty. So we're going to say count of response. So which means response must be an array and there must be a value inside of it. So at least one element. So if this is true, we want to set error to be equal to array merge. So we've done this previously. So we want to merge our validation error alongside with the response. If this is false, what we want to do is to set errors to be equal to our validation errors. So we can actually just break this into separate lines. So on line 27, we are checking if response is an array and there's at least one element inside of response. If that is true, then we perform an array merge on our validation error and the response. Otherwise, we're just going to return our validation error, right? So we could actually just get rid of the error here and just return it directly. Okay, so we can actually do it like this and still achieve the same result. If this is not the case, we want to return true. So if there is no validation error and also response is not an array, we just return true. So this means the validation actually passed. So let's come here and then say pass validation errors. Okay, so with this, we're making it very easy for us to avoid repeating ourselves. So what we're going to do now is to just continue with our channels controller and see how we can actually use this to perform our validation. So let's come back here. Right here, we already have the validator object. What we now want to do is to create a variable called error. So this should be errors. It should be equal to validate. So that will be the new class that we created, validator EPA. And here we want to call the pass error method. So we need to pass it request, and we also need to pass in the validator. So this is all that we need to do now to actually get our validation errors if there are any. So we can now come here and say if is array errors. Remember, if this is an array, it means that there were actually validation errors. So we can actually just return the view. So that will be the same view that we used to actually show the form. So let's just grab all of this. And this time we want to compat errors. But if this is not the case, then we want to actually save the request. So we want to actually create a new channel. So in order for us to create a channel, we need to create a model. So we're going to come to the command line and then say PHP legato add. We want to add a model. We also want to put this inside of a folder called admin. And then we want to call this channel. So the rule of thumb is to use the singular form for our model names, while we use the plural form for our table names. So that way, Eloquent ORM is able to actually figure out the name of the table without us explicitly specifying the name. So we're going to create two, one for the channels, and the second one is going to be for sub channels. Then we can get back again to our test editor inside of the admin folder, channels. And then right now we want to specify the feeds inside of the tables that we want to allow for mass assignment. So if you don't want to actually do this, then you can actually use the new method to create a new instance of the channel model, like we actually did when we created a user. So when we created a user, here we called new on the user model. So this way we don't need to actually specify the feeds that can be populated using mass assignment, but we want to explicitly specify that we only want few feeds to be updated using mass assignment. We can now get back again to channels controller, and then right here we can then say channel. So that will be channel app models create. So we call the create method and then pass it an array. So the first feed that we want to populate will be the name feed. So that will be equal to request input name. And then the next one is going to be the slug feed. So duplicate that and then just say slug. Then this is going to be equal to request input name. But then we're going to call a function to actually convert whatever is being typed in here to a slug. So we can say string slug and then pass it request input name. Then we can come to a new line and just say return view. So we want to essentially return the same view. So we can just grab this, then come here, paste it here. And then here we want to say success and then say channel created. All right, so let's quickly test this out on the browser. Going to start by checking our validation. So let's come back to channel. Then let's try to submit the form without any data. So we get an error here. The name feed is required, which means the refactoring that we did for our validation is actually working fine. So here I'm going to try to put in some numbers. Try to submit. Says the name feed must be of type string, and then an example is being provided here. So one thing that we may want to do is to actually preserve the old input, so whatever the user typed in before submitting the form. So let's come back again to the form. So that will be admin channel.blade.php. Then right here we can pass in a value, and then we can just echo old. So we can echo old name. Then let's try to do a reload on the browser. Then enter in the wrong value. Okay, so right now we get that value being preserved. So let's now try to persist this into the database. So let's call our first channel programming. Then let's click on add channel. And here we get an error, app models channel not found. So let's try to do composer dump auto load. Then let's get back to the form. Then try to create that. So we get channel created successfully. Let's now look at our database. So that will be for me db.local. So let's come to links database and then channels. So right here we have the record that we just created. And I can see here that there's a typo in the archived column. So that's not spelled correctly. I'm going to quickly just fix that. So let's come to structure and then change this. So let's just correct the spelling. So that will be archived, archived. So save, come to sub channels, see if we made the same mistake here. Nice. Okay, so to quickly fix this and then just save.